Welcome to a super special episode of International Politics. Today I am joined by a very special guest. This is Dr. Kolby Hanson. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the Naval War College, and he's an expert on civil wars, which is why we are having him on the show today. So we thought that this morning we would just go get some coffee and maybe chat a little bit about civil wars.
Sounds good.
All right.
But I realized this great author, Thucydides, I'm pretty sure we've been mispronouncing his name this entire time. I'm pretty sure the Greeks didn't have a soft C like that. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be Thucydides.
Thanks so much for joining us to talk about civil wars. What is a civil war?
So there are a lot of civil wars around the world that have attracted our attention. There was the 30-year Civil War in Northern Ireland. There's the civil wars in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s. There's the war in Syria today. The U.S. even had its own civil war in the 1860s. But to be more specific about what it actually is, all these cases have some things in common. First, they're violent, right? There's actual fatalities. It's not just wars of words. And some of the larger ones we call civil wars. Some of the smaller ones we call civil conflicts, which are not quite as big, but still important. Second, they have to be internal to a state. They can't be between different states fighting each other. Third, they have to be actually political. They can't just be criminal. They have to be fighting over some government institution, whether it's the government of a region or whether it's the government of the entire state. Fourth, they have to be organized. They have to be fought between at least two different organized armed groups fighting each other, not just a riot, not just a massacre. It has to be two organized groups.
So now that we know what a civil war is, why should we, in a class on international politics, be talking about a civil war?
Well, I see two big reasons. The first is civil wars are really costly and really deadly. Since World War II, there have been about 5 times as many deaths from intrastate conflicts, from civil wars, as there have been from interstate conflicts between countries. Civil wars can also cause big refugee crises, like the ones we're seeing in Syria and its surrounding area today. They can also replace governments. The 1990s civil war in Afghanistan brought the Taliban to power, who then in turn hosted al-Qaeda and caused major security problems across the world. The second reason I see is because civil wars are so important, they often invite lots of international intervention, which can escalate into larger regional conflicts. Most of the actual fighting during the Cold War, for example, was not between countries, but was actually in these so-called proxy wars, civil wars in countries like Afghanistan and Vietnam, which involved outside actors. Similarly, today, conflicts like Syria and Yemen have invited countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, Turkey, countries that are interested in the outcome of the conflict and all getting involved and fighting on different sides as a result.
So what are civil wars fought over?
So we generally divide civil wars into two types. First, there are conflicts over the central government, like Syria or Afghanistan. These are cases in which one group, whether it's an ideological group, whether it's an ethnic group, whether it's a religious group, wants more representation in the government or wants to overthrow the current government. Second, there are separatist conflicts. So separatist conflicts like Northern Ireland or the American Civil War, there's one region, whether it's an ethnically distinct region or other kind of region, wants to secede from the state, to break away and form its own independent state, or even to join up with another state. It's called an irredentist conflict. Now, there's some disagreement about whether to include anti-colonial conflicts as part of separatist conflicts, like the Algerian uprising against the French in the 1960s, or the American War of Independence, for example. Some people think that these kinds of conflicts have their own real dynamics historically and racially, and should be treated as a separate phenomenon we should study separately. I sometimes doubt that, because I wonder if we're defining what is the homeland versus what is a colony after the fact. If, for example, the rebels win a conflict, we might say, oh, it was a colony, not really part of the original homeland. But if the government wins, we say it's a failed civil war.
So why do people fight in these conflicts?
So this is the topic of my research, so it's something I'm really passionate about. I sometimes think about these motivations as self-oriented motivations and community-oriented motivations. So first, there can be a lot of personal gain in joining a rebel movement or in joining the government. Having a weapon can be really empowering, especially for young men of low social status or who are poor. It can mean opportunities to loot or extort other people. People often worry about diamonds or drugs for this reason, empowering conflict by driving a lot of people to take up arms. It can also give people a sense of power and allow them to settle old scores or take revenge on people that have wronged them. One former rebel told me pretty flatly, I joined because I wanted to hold a gun and be rich. Some people are also kidnapped by rebel groups, but it's actually very hard to force someone to fight for you, to risk their lives, if they haven't volunteered to join. So it happens a lot less than you would think, and those recruits tend to be a lot less useful in combat because they haven't actually chosen to join. Second, there are a whole lot of reasons why someone might feel a connection to the community or to the cause that they're fighting for. People might experience a personal tragedy or loss that they want revenge for from the government. Lots of people have family members who have been harmed by the enemy. They might also be convinced of an ideology by friends or their social networks. Lots of people who join armed groups are part of community organizations that are tied to those armed groups. Also, they might see supporting the armed group as doing something good for their community. Lots of armed groups provide protection for local communities and provide local public goods that convince people that that group really supports the community that they're claiming to. So the big point here is that the reasons that people join armed groups are not always the same reasons that the groups themselves are fighting for. And this creates a big disconnect, a moral hazard problem. People who join an armed group might actually be willing to take risks with the reputation of the group that the armed leaders are not comfortable with. They might abuse civilians, they might loot certain areas and ruin the group's reputation. They might also desert in battle to save their own skin or defect to the enemy, things that are really dangerous for an armed movement, but are nevertheless in the interests of the individual person.
So, if civil wars are so costly, why do they happen?
So, there are political disagreements everywhere, but civil wars are actually quite uncommon in the world. And that's because they're so costly. As we know from the bargaining model of war, two sides should be able to reach an agreement if conflict is costly. The issue is that civil wars have a particularly difficult commitment problem. When two states try to make an agreement, when they make an agreement, they can both go back to their opposite sides of the border and maintain their armed forces. To be able to, if anything goes wrong, they can always initiate the fight again to try to fix the problem. In a civil war, though, at the end of the day, both sides have to coexist in the same state, and usually one has control of the military. That means whoever's in charge can always go back on the deal that they struck beforehand. So once trust breaks down between two political groups within a state, it can be hard to come to any kind of agreement that both sides can trust. That's why international peacekeepers are so important, because if the two sides in a conflict can't trust each other, they need someone else to come in from the outside and make sure both sides are following any deal that is struck between the two.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us about civil wars. This has been super informative.
It's nice to see you all.